Joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have independent international affairs analyst Gilbert Doctorow, who's joining us from Brussels. Also, we have journalist, activist, and political analyst John Bosnich, who's joining us from Belgrade. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Doctorow in Brussels. We're seeing a defiant, I must say, tone from NATO as they want to continue supplying arms to Ukraine. That's opposed to a lot of talk about negotiations as being the only way to end this war. Tell us more about NATO's stance.
Well, Mr. Stoltenberg is nothing more than a frontman for the U.S. Pentagon. To believe that he has an independent opinion on most anything would be a big mistake. He has said today, or in his remarks about the necessity for NATO and others to supply further arms to Ukraine in the belief that this will assure a Ukrainian victory or at least a good position in negotiations, that is based on a fairy tale. It has no correspondence to the realities on the ground and the relative strength of the Russian and the Ukrainian sides, particularly keeping in mind the way the Russians have allowed the Ukrainians to weaken themselves, virtually to destroy themselves by their incessant attacks to demonstrate to the West that they are alive and active when the only result has been devastation of their military units. The interesting thing for me about Mr. Stoltenberg is that he continues to exist and to perform his duties as a frontman, which must provide him with very little personal comfort. The interesting thing further is that his role, his position, will become vacant in a not too distant future, and I consider with interest who is being put up to replace him. And the most notable such case is Chrystia Freeland, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. I wonder how in the world she could trade an active position with some kind of influence on government policy as the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada for an absolutely empty position, which Mr. Stoltenberg now occupies.
John Bosnich, the NATO chief, justified further weapons supplies to Ukraine. He says that most wars end through negotiations, but Ukraine can achieve more if it succeeds militarily. Is that the case in your opinion?
Of course it's not. It's actually revealing the deeper motivations of NATO, which is just a weapons sales mechanism for the American military-industrial complex. He needs to sell more weapons to make a bigger cut. This is a cartel, an arms sales cartel, and we are seeing them realize that they've lost the war and trying to make as much money as they can. NATO is not in the business of winning wars. They're in the business of selling weapons.
Right. What about the issue of negotiations? How far do you see these two countries being from any actual progress in the talks? We know Ukraine has a 10-point peace plan. On the other side, Russia believes that Ukraine has to accept the annexation of those four regions. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel right now, Mr. Bosnich?
Well, first of all, Russia's position is not just about annexation of those regions, it's a return of those regions to Russia.
Sure.
Those were Russian territories before, and they need to be returned to Russia because Ukraine led Ukrainian hardcore Vatican-supported ultranationalists ran a war of genocide for 8 years that the Western lying mainstream media refused to cover. So that's why the people in the West don't know what's going on. What they've been told is that a war started from nowhere for no reason in February when evil Putin decided to invade and occupy Ukraine. Nothing could be further from the truth. What we've got here is a situation where President Putin intervened to stop genocide against Russians that had already started since 2014. It's an amazing testament to the power of the lying mainstream media that the people of the West had no idea that this war was ongoing and that tens of thousands of people had already been killed before Russia intervened to bring peace and to separate those who are Russians and recognize their Russianhood and those who deny their Russian identity and have taken weapons, money, and bribes to fight against their own blood brothers from Russia.
And Mr. Doctorow, your thoughts on the issue of negotiations and ending this war through talks? Is there light at the end of the tunnel, in your opinion? And also, do you think that the Western backers of Ukraine even want this war to end?
The United States is looking for a long war in the hope of bleeding Russia white. So they are not in favor of it. When you spoke in your outset about two countries, there are not two countries here in play. There's one country, which is called Russia, and then there's a territory called Ukraine. Behind Ukraine are the people who are pulling all the strings, and that's the United States. The United States does not want peace. The United States will ensure that there is no peace negotiation. The Russians have this understood, and they will act accordingly by settling the issue on the battlefield and enforcing the destruction of the Ukraine's military forces and possibly the replacement of the government in Kiev. So that is how this game will play out.
All right, thanks a lot, gentlemen. Gillard Doctorow joining us from Brussels and Mr. John Bosnich joining us from Belgrade. With that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review, but stick around, there's plenty more to come here on Press TV.